Welcome back, deep divers. You guys sent in a really interesting case, a true crime mystery that took over a decade to really solve. We're going to take a deep dive into police reports, court documents, and even an episode of 48 Hours called The Haunting of David Coffin. Are you ready to unpack all of this with us?
Absolutely. It's so interesting how a case that seems, at first, pretty straightforward can spiral into so many different accounts and missing evidence. It makes you think about the truth and justice and how difficult those can be.
For sure. Let's go back in time to December 1996 in Atlanta. We're starting with what seems like a pretty tragic accident, a house fire. But then David Coffin's body is found, and the story takes a sharp turn. It wasn't an accident after all, was it?
Yep. At first, everyone thought the fire was the cause of death, but firefighters found David's body lying on his back. That's not typical. People trying to escape a fire usually collapse face down.
Yeah.
And, well, the autopsy showed that David had been shot in the head before the fire even started.
That's scary. A murder made to look like an accident. So, of course, everyone's wondering who wanted David dead. And this is where things get really interesting, really messy. We've got a love triangle, right? Tell us about the people involved.
Of course. The investigation zeroed in on the relationships between David, his girlfriend Megan Lee, and her soon-to-be ex-husband, Scott Davis. The divorce wasn't going well, not at all. Scott was having a really hard time with the separation. He kept calling Megan, begging her to come back, and he was obviously jealous of David.
Okay, so a jealous ex-husband, that's definitely a motive. But it gets even crazier, doesn't it? There were a bunch of weird things that happened before the fire at David's house.
Yeah, a lot of strange events. Like just days before the fire, David's house was robbed, a bunch of stuff was taken, including his Porsche. Then, Scott reports being attacked not just once, but twice by someone wearing a mask who told him to leave Megan alone. Don't you think the timing of those attacks is super suspicious?
Oh, for sure. It's way too close to the robbery at David's place and right before the fire. It feels like a distraction. Then we have the most suspicious thing of all, something Scott said that really points to him. Tell us about that.
So just hours after Scott says he was attacked that second time, he tells Megan that the police were at a scene where a guy was shot in the head and then his house was burned down. Here's the thing. The police hadn't told anyone about the gunshot or how the fire started. How would Scott know those details?
That's a huge problem for him. It sounds like he knew about the crime, like he was there. With the suspicious behavior, the timing, and what he said, it seems like the police had their guy, right?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
With all that, they arrested Scott for David's murder. But then the case takes a sharp turn. Despite everything, there was no physical evidence connecting Scott to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing from David's house was ever found with Scott.
No smoking gun, huh? But the lack of physical evidence isn't all. Scott's alibi had problems too, didn't it?
Yeah, a few. Like David's Porsche was found on fire miles away from where Scott said he was. The timing of the Porsche fire didn't match his alibi at all. And there was no proof he was ever attacked, which made his story even harder to believe. Do you think those inconsistencies are enough to make you question his whole story?
Definitely. And to make things even worse, it turns out Scott tried to get a friend to lie for him, to give him a fake alibi. But instead of helping, the friend went to the police. That backfired big time, right?
Totally. It made Scott look like he was trying to cover up something, guilty or not. So, no physical evidence, problems with his story, and now this. The DA had to drop the charges against Scott.
What do you think about this early part of the investigation? Did the police and the DA mess up, or was Scott just super lucky?
It's tough to say. They had a suspect with a reason and some pretty incriminating actions. But the lack of evidence and the holes in his story are hard to ignore. It definitely leaves a lot of questions. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Even though he wasn't charged, people still suspected Scott. Right. And the case was far from over, especially for David's father. He never believed anything other than that Scott was guilty, and he kept fighting to get justice for his son.
David's dad never gave up. That's powerful. It says a lot about a parent's love, and the need for justice. While he kept fighting, Scott tried to move on. Went to California, new job, and get this, he ran for governor. I mean, that's a bold move for someone who is a prime suspect in a murder case. What do you think about that?
It is interesting. Trying to reinvent himself, being in the public eye like that, makes you think about what he was thinking. Was it a way to get away from his past, or was he in denial, trying to look innocent? It definitely makes him a more complex character. It makes you question his motives even more.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. But no matter what he was thinking, his past caught up with him. Years later, a new prosecutor, Sheila Ross, reopened the case. She seemed pretty set on getting justice for David, right?
Oh, yeah. She really felt Scott had gotten away with murder. But reopening a cold case like this, especially with so little physical evidence, that's tough. How do you even build a case when it's all about what people remember and what happened so long ago?
That's where Megan comes in, right? She had moved to Australia trying to start fresh. But this case was still hanging over her. Her testimony became really important, didn't it?
Totally. She came back to Atlanta to testify against Scott. She talked about how obsessed he was with her, how he acted so strange, and of course, about that incriminating thing he said about David's death. Do you think what she said was enough to convince the jury? Especially without any physical evidence.
Hard to tell. But her story definitely gave the case more weight, more emotion. The trial was a battle of stories. The prosecution said Scott was a jealous ex-husband who went too far. The defense said he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of a vengeful ex-wife, and cops who were too quick to judge. So how did the defense fight back against that? Did they have any other ideas about who did it?
Their main argument was that there was no physical evidence, and Megan's memory couldn't be trusted after all this time. They said the police were so focused on Scott, they missed other possibilities. They even brought in experts to say that Scott couldn't have done everything they said he did, especially with the Porsche burning so far away.
So they basically tried to create doubt without giving any real answers. Pretty classic defense strategy. But did they have any other theories about who might have killed David?
Not really. They just questioned how thorough the first investigation was.
Okay.
They said other people might have had a reason to kill David, but were ignored because everyone was so focused on Scott. They also said the robbery at David's house might not have had anything to do with Scott, meaning it could have been a random act of violence, not connected to the love triangle at all. What do you think is the most interesting part of the defense's strategy?
I think it's interesting that they didn't try to blame someone else specifically. They just tried to make the prosecution's case look weak. But the most surprising thing to me was that Scott didn't testify. What do you think about that?
That's always a risky move, makes people wonder. The defense said it was to avoid being questioned by the prosecution, but it's a gamble. The jury might think he's staying quiet because he's guilty. Why do you think he did that? Was it planned? Or was there something else going on?
Tough to say without knowing what he was thinking. Maybe he thought the prosecution's case wasn't strong enough to worry about. Or maybe he was afraid of messing up his own story. Whatever the reason, it was a big decision, and it probably influenced how the jury saw him.
No doubt. It's a classic dilemma talk, or stay silent. Both are risky. For Scott, who knows what effect it had on the verdict?
With two different stories, no physical evidence, and Scott staying silent, the jury had a lot to think about. Do you think they had enough to make a fair decision? Or was it more about feelings and guesses than actual facts?
That's a good question, probably on a lot of people's minds. Without something concrete tying Scott to the murder, the decision came down to whether the jury believed the evidence and the people who testified. It shows how justice can be subjective, especially when the truth is so hard to find.
Yeah, this case really shows how hard it can be to get justice in a complicated case like this. But finally, after weeks of testimony and thinking, the jury came back with a decision. What happened? Did they say Scott was guilty of murdering David Coffin? They did. Guilty. Scott Davis was convicted of murder, and they sentenced him to life in prison. What was it like in the courtroom when they read the verdict?
Oh, it was intense. A lot of emotions. David's family, they had waited so long for this, and they just started crying. Relief, sadness, maybe some closure. But on Scott's side, people were shocked, heartbroken. They still believe he's innocent.
It's a big reminder of how much power a jury has.
Yeah.
And how it changes everyone's lives. But even with the conviction, there are still questions, right?
Yeah, for sure. Still no physical evidence. And that makes you wonder, did he really do it alone? Was someone else involved? Did they just rush to blame him because of the pressure to solve the case? What do you think?
It's possible. And what about Megan? Do we know for sure that she was telling the truth? Or did everything that happened, all the trauma, maybe even subconsciously, make her want to see Scott go to prison? Could time and her emotions have changed her memories?
That's a good point. Memory is tricky, especially with something traumatic. Maybe her feelings at the time and all the years that have passed changed how she saw things. It really shows how hard it is to rely on what people remember, especially in a case like this with so much emotion involved.
This case is a perfect example of how important relationships and actions can be. Even without clear physical proof, it makes you think about the limits of our justice system. What do you do when it's all about different interpretations and people saying different things? How much can you trust circumstantial evidence, especially when it's mixed up with things like jealousy and obsession?
It's a tough balance. Circumstantial evidence can be strong, but you have to be careful and make sure it's not twisted or given too much weight. This case really shows how important it is to investigate thoroughly, look at all the evidence objectively, and consider all the possibilities, not just the ones that seem to fit.
The David Coffin case is really haunting. Even though there was a conviction, we still don't know the whole truth. It's a story that makes us think about how complicated people can be, the power of love and loss, and the never-ending search for justice, even when it's incredibly difficult. So, after all of this, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from this case?
I think this deep dive goes beyond just a true crime story. It gives us a look at the human experience, obsession, grief, how our memories work, and how our justice system isn't perfect. The biggest takeaway is that the truth can be hard to find. It's often hidden under layers of time, emotions, and different points of view. Even when a verdict is reached, the search for answers might continue, leaving us with uncertainty. It's a haunting reminder that some mysteries might never be fully solved.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the strange and confusing case of David Coffin. We hope this deep dive gave you some new perspectives and made you curious about truth, justice, and what it means to be human. If you want to explore more cases like this or have any thoughts about the David Coffin case, let us know. We love hearing from you. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the world around you.